Have you ever thought about how chapter books are usually turned into audiobooks, but picture books aren't? Well, this week's podcast wants to change that. It's called the Daydreaming Podcast, and it's a wonderful way to help your kiddos expand their imagination and be introduced to more fabulous stories. I'm Andy Smiley, the Friendly Podcast Guide. I'm a mom who has used podcasts to fight the boredom and loneliness of motherhood, and now I want to help you find a podcast that can do the same thing for you. It can be overwhelming to try and find a podcast you'll enjoy in the thousands of shows that are out there. That's where I come in. My episodes are short and they answer all of the questions you'll have about the podcast, so you'll know if it's a good fit for you or not. I'm here to help you find a podcast you'll love without wasting your time. Now, let's talk podcasts. Benjamin Carroll, the producer, describes the show like this. The Daydreaming Podcast is where stories come to life. Partnering with independent authors and writers, the Daydreaming Podcast combines an endless variety of wonderfully entertaining children's stories with immersive sound effects and professional narrators. The Daydreaming Podcast has two different types of episodes. One is the story episodes, and those are usually around 15 to 20 minutes long. And the poetry episodes are usually only a minute or two. Before we learn more about the vibe of the Daydreaming Podcast, we're going to take a quick break to talk about my guide to help you create a podcast trailer in less than 2 hours. Your podcast needs a trailer. It doesn't matter if you haven't launched your podcast yet or if you've had a podcast for 10 years. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I've heard that podcast trailers are helpful, but I don't have time to set aside to make that happen. That's where you're wrong. Making a podcast trailer doesn't have to take weeks. You can create a beautiful podcast trailer in less than 2 hours that will get potential listeners to start listening to your show and keep listening. All you have to do is follow my step-by-step podcast trailer guide. Go through each of the 8 steps, and by the end, you will have an awesome podcast trailer. Grab this guide in the link in the show notes. Now we get to hear from Benjamin about how his life took a bit of a 180 when he started having kids and how his job drastically changed. Benjamin, welcome to the Friendly Podcast Guide. I'm so excited to have you here to talk about your podcast, the Daydreaming Podcast. Before we dive into your show, can you introduce yourself a little bit to my listeners?
Well, thank you so much for having me. So as you said, my name is Benjamin Carroll. I am the owner and founder of the Daydreaming Network, where stories come to life. And of course, we'll talk a lot about that. But over the last 10 years, I'm a engineer by trade, graduated from Georgia Tech, go Jackets. Way too proud of that football team, even though we're not that very good. I have 3 beautiful kids, my lovely wife, who support me in doing all of this. They are the inspirations behind why, I do what I do. And so I thank them so much for being a part of that. And that's really kind of me in a real tiny little nutshell.
Perfect. I love it. Let's dive into the Daydreaming Podcast. Why did you start this kid podcast?
So I used to work in, as all great podcast careers start, I used to work in a major manufacturing where we used to do like big, heavy machinery work where I used to build boats and all this various stuff. And it was very cool. And I had a particular path I was going down. But then when you have kids, apparently it changes your entire life. And I was very happy to dive right into that world. And, the more you give to it, the more it gives back to you. So it's always been great. And then as, my first, we had a second one, then we had a third one, and then the now 6-year-old who's the oldest, they go off to kindergarten and you get all like, it's going so fast. And then they start getting introduced to the world and you're like, oh no, like, the world, what are you doing? And, and as that was happening, it was great to see them blossom and become who they are. And it's great to keep on watching it. But then, there's this iPad that snuck into my house and I was just watching and I was like, and you're kind of curious about like, what's on there. And I realized I have no earthly idea what she's watching. And no matter how much you can, you can only do, you can't be on them the whole time. You want them to have their own little space. But so I was like, okay, well, I kind of want to like be a part of this. I'm an engineer. So I was kind of thinking like, maybe I can think of a solution for this. And there's always this great content, but nothing better to do than do it yourself. So I published my first book, children's book, For Those Who Dream. As you'll see, there's a dreaming, yes, theme going on in this world and in my life. So I did that. And then I realized I saw some inefficiencies in the world of, kids, self-published kids books. So I was like, ooh, I think I got something. And so I started last year, and I think we're almost at a year now, where we started writing our own content and creating, we did narrations, immersive sound effects. And so that was all me initially. And then it turned into, we got people to start putting their books on our site. And then we got narrators who were much better at doing it than what I'm doing. So they are actually professionals, and they are wonderful people. And so then as it slowly turned into, now we are the Daydreaming Podcast, where we are, we have a lot of kids books where we bring them to life about people who are very passionate about, their stories and want to share stories with kids and families around the world. So it's been a very fun journey over the last year.
Definitely. And we love kid podcasts at our house. We are a very pro kid podcast family. So I'm so grateful that you create kid podcasts so that we can partake of them. And yeah, they're just the best. We love them. We use them all the time at our house. So you mentioned trying to not get rid of screens completely, because that isn't feasible in the world that we live in with kids. But you mentioned that being part of the reason you started your show. So is that maybe one of the things that you want people to get out of your podcast? One of the things you want kids and parents to get out is maybe a little less screen time in their life?
Oh, yes, just an alternative. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of up the audio game. So, I think there's a lot of there's some audiobooks out there where for the really big time audiobooks, they do sound effects. And so I was like, what if I did that for kids? I think they would respond so well to it, because kids are all about the environment you give them. And with a screen, it's so stimulating to their minds. So I was like, okay, well, if I add if we can get the sound effects and really capture the sense of the story. And really, if they're walking down a street, you hear the cars in the background, you hear the footsteps on the ground. If there's wind in the trees, you hear we try to capture as much of the story that the author tried to portray in there. And then from there, we let their minds do the work. How one kid will imagine the story, it might be maybe a little different than how the other kid imagines the story. And even though there's pictures to it, but it's like reading Harry Potter before the movies came out. Yes. It allows you to, allows their minds to unlock in a way that maybe they don't get the opportunity very much. And so we just want to be a tool for parents and for, teachers to be able to kind of take a new look on it and to be able to just provide an alternative, a very high quality alternative for screen time. Because like you said, you can't avoid screens are going to happen. You can't, and they're not all bad. It's just, that moderation part of it.
Definitely. Yeah. I like to say that kid podcasts help kids use their imagination muscle and build that muscle. And like you said, I feel like it kind of, it unlocks it, right? It unlocks that imagination, and kids can do amazing things when they are when they can create and imagine all of the possibilities in our world. So I love that. How would you describe the vibe of the Daydreaming Podcast?
So we provide a wide variety of stories. So it is one day it could be an adventure, or sometimes it could be about struggle. We have all various types of stories. All these authors have such wonderful stories to tell, and so they're all different. And so really, I think the overall vibe is we're just trying to create an enriching environment, kind of, as you said, unlock that inspiration behind them, to where as they grow up, they have all these touch points to where, and that's how empathy starts, is being able to have those touch points. So it's a lot of fun, because that's what keeps my job really interesting, is because every day is different. You never run out of ideas of how to turn a story into something, because they're all capturing these amazing little tiny details in life.
Definitely. I love that. Okay, so I like to ask podcasters what their favorite episode is, but before I do that, so you have a second to think about it, where can people find you, your show, social media, all of that stuff?
So we are on all major platforms. We are on Apple, Spotify, all the good stuff. We're also on one of our favorite platforms is Yodo, which is this screenless player, and we absolutely love Yodo because they take the screenless game to a whole new level. All these various kids podcasts kind of go into one spot, and you get to enjoy all this kind of content. So it's really cool. So when it comes to our favorite episodes, there are many. We have done a lot.
Totally.
So the ones that kind of stick out in my mind are kind of how they made me. Sometimes even when you're creating a story, even as a parent, I'm not sure if you've ever had this experience where it's like you're reading a story to your kid and you're like, you find yourself inspired, or like you find yourself getting caught up in a story and you're like,
yes.
Oh, so it's like, that's and so some of those stories, that's how this, those are the stories that make me feel, where there's one story called What I See Is Love. And what was cool about that story is I am blanking on the author's name and I am so sorry.
We'll make sure to link it in the show notes. Don't worry about it.
Show notes, perfect. So what the story is we got the opportunity. So what I See Is Love, and it was cool because it was a simple story, but it was also about, we tried to, as much as we can, bottle up in audio form love and try to portray it the best we could. And sure. I spent a lot of time, probably more time than I should have on that episode, just trying to really get it going and get it together. And so we had that one. And then we have one that's also called The Golden Quest, which is, as you see, these are two different stories. So this other one is called The Golden Quest, where it's it's going to be 30 minutes. It's actually launching, by the time we're doing our recordings, it is actually launching next week. It's actually about a kid learning about financial stuff. So it's an entirely different set of stories. And it was 30 minutes. And the story that was created was this long, epic. We've gone through farms. We went to the asteroid belt. We went to a university. We went everywhere. And just trying to weave the story in and trying to we try to, because you have a little bit of music in there, a lot of sound effects. This file was massive. And so it's an epic story. And it's, so that was a lot of fun because it was just so creative, having to do all the various, where the story went. So
totally. Yeah. Well, and I have found as a parent that trying to teach my kids something is so much easier when I make it entertaining in some way. And it sounds like this is incredibly entertaining.
It is. And you never knew what the story was going to. And you're like, wait, what is happening? So it was very cool. And so I actually get to, not to shamelessly plug another thing that we do, is that we also do a interview segment where we do Within the Margin, which is our interview channel, which is upcoming in February. So actually, we will actually have an interview with the author about that story and kind of his inspiration behind all of that. So that's going to be very cool. I'm really excited to kind of pick his brain about, why he picked what he picked. That's going to be really cool, is understanding. So we have the stories for the kids, but then having a conversation with the parents about hey, these are the people entertaining your kids. I want you to know, I want you to trust me. I want you to trust the authors who are putting stories on. We want you to have that, because it's such an intimate thing. When you have these stories, is you're letting us into your child's mind, and we take that to the utmost seriousness about, and thanking people that we're honored to let us into such an intimate part of their lives. Definitely. Yeah. Because if you think about when you're reading a kid's book, it's at the very intimate parts of your life. It's at the time for bedtime, during relaxation time. It's when you're giving your child a time to, settle down for the day. For parents who work all the time, that might be the one little spot that they have that maybe they're enjoying a story together. And so that's why when you look at other kids' podcasts, I do praise them for everything they're doing, because there's so many good quality podcasts out there that we just want to be, we want to be a part of that journey of helping people nurture their kids and, share that time together. Totally. Yes. Okay. So with kid podcasters, I always like to ask, what is the target age range for kid podcasts? I know that kids of all ages usually listen to kid podcasts, but who are you making these shows for? So a lot of times with how we're doing our stories, the sound effects and everything, it's kind of meant for all. We kind of cater to 10 and under, 12 and under, because even though if a story is only from 4 to 6, or it's from, or maybe let's say a story is from 6 to 10, Well, a lot of times that's because of the reading level, because you can't give a kid the graphic novel that we had, you can't give a 6-year-old or a 4-year-old that book and they're going to be able to read it.
Right.
But they will be entertained by all the fun sound effects and have it being read to them.
Yes.
So we, when it's our content's on there, we're trying to, we don't usually put baby boards on there where it's like really simple. Like, with the sound effects, every kid can kind of enjoy the story, whether or not they pick up on everything, that's, if you want to test them, you can, but, but it's just, we're just here to entertain. And so we're 12 and under is about where we're at, we don't want, everything's going to be, we try to keep it fun. We try to keep it exciting. So.
Totally. Yeah. I've noticed that even my younger kids, like they can still get the gist of what's going on, even if they don't understand all the words, when there are sound effects and music and all of those things that kind of just help them like clue into what's going on. So perfect.
Exactly.
Is there anything else that you want to add that we haven't touched on yet?
Like I said, the Within the Margin podcast is coming out in February, which we're very excited about. Just because it kind of does a whole new layer to what we're doing, kind of getting even more in depth with, with the stories that we're trying to tell. And we're just excited because this 2024 is going to be really exciting. We have so many books on the docket because we're a daily curated, not every episode's new, just because we're still gathering more and more of a catalog, but we're hoping to get to the point where every day we have a new story to tell. And so we're excited to increase the volume and keep it coming. So, we're just really excited for, what 2024 is going to have to offer.
That's awesome. And I know that my kids will love that because sometimes they get through all the podcast episodes and they're like, why is there not more? I'm like, well, podcast hosts have lives too. So sometimes we can only do so much. And so
exactly.
I love it when there's a new episode every day. Then it's easy. It's an easy win for parents. So thank you for doing that.
Of course. No, of course. It's really exciting because it's, we're just wanting to, again, having young kids, they're always wanting more. And so being able to entertain kids is like, that's it's a calling and it's very fun to do. So.
Well, I'm so glad. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. And I am so excited to introduce all of my listeners to the Daydreaming Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
We love a good story at our house. So the Daydreaming Podcast is definitely going into our normal rotation. If you know someone or a family who could use the Daydreaming Podcast in their life, will you share this episode with them? Also, if you've been putting off making a podcast trailer, but it's time, grab my step-by-step podcast trailer guide. Talk to you soon.